There is a smell investigators who entered that building in October 2023 say they will never forget. They had been called to a funeral home in Penrose, Colorado, a small town about 2 hours south of Denver, after a tip suggested something was wrong inside. What they found stopped them before they could even fully enter the building. Some rooms could not be entered at all, not because of locked doors, because the bodies were stacked too high. According to federal court records and statements from the FBI, agents had to lay physical boards across the floor just to move through the facility, to keep themselves above the fluid that had accumulated beneath them. That fluid was later pumped out of the building with equipment. When the final count was complete, investigators had recovered the remains of nearly 190 human beings: fathers, mothers, grandparents, children, people whose families had paid for cremations, attended services and gone home believing their loved ones were at peace. None of them had been cremated, and the man responsible, the owner of Return to Nature Funeral Home, Jon Hallford, was not inside that building. He was living his life, spending the money, driving the cars, shopping at Gucci. This is the story of what he did, and what it cost the people who trusted him. Penrose, Colorado, population just over 3,000, a quiet stretch of land in Fremont County, surrounded by high desert and distant mountain ranges. It is the kind of community where people know each other, where local businesses carry a kind of personal trust that larger cities rarely offer. Jon Hallford opened Return to Nature Funeral Home in that community with a stated mission. He said later in court, under oath, that he had opened the business to make a positive impact in people's lives. Funeral homes occupy a particular and sacred role. Families come to them at their lowest point, raw with grief, unable to think clearly, placing complete faith in the person behind the desk. They sign documents, they hand over payment, they trust that everything from that moment forward will be handled with care. For the families who came through the doors of Return to Nature, that trust was the foundation of everything. Jon Hallford and his wife Carrie Hallford ran the operation together. On the surface it appeared to be a legitimate business. Families made arrangements, services were held, urns were collected. Life moved on, as it must, in the painful way it always does after loss. But beginning in 2019, according to federal prosecutors and court records, what the Hallfords were doing behind closed doors bore no resemblance to what they had promised. They were not cremating the bodies in their care. They were storing them in a building that, over the span of 4 years, would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Colorado history. The Return to Nature facility in Penrose was a squat, low building unremarkable from the outside. In a town that size, it drew no particular attention. A hearse parked out front was not unusual. Deliveries came and went. Inside, according to investigators and court records, conditions had been deteriorating for years. The bodies were not being processed. They were being placed inside the building and left. As months passed and the number of uncremated remains grew, the facility became something investigators struggled to fully describe to the court. One called it, in documented testimony, a scene unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. Bodies were stacked on top of one another. Some were in various stages of advanced decomposition. Bug infestation had taken hold throughout the facility. The biological byproduct of decomposition, fluids had spread across the floor to the low extent that investigators could not safely stand on it without protection. FBI agents placed boards down to walk above the accumulation. They moved carefully, documenting what they found, room by room. When the full recovery effort was complete, the number of bodies found inside that building reached nearly 190. According to federal court records, the operation had been running this way since at least 2019, for nearly 4 years. Families across Colorado had no idea. They had held memorials, they had spread ashes, they had placed urns on mantles in their homes and prayed over them and drawn comfort from them. Those ashes were fake. The Hallfords had been sending families home with fraudulent remains, a fabricated substitute, while the actual bodies of their loved ones remained inside that building, decomposing alongside the remains of strangers. According to court documents, in at least 2 cases, the situation was even more catastrophic. The wrong body had been buried entirely. Families who believed they had laid their loved one to rest had, in fact, buried someone else. While the building in Penrose descended into a condition that investigators would later describe in federal court in language usually reserved for disaster zones, Jon Hallford and his wife were not struggling. They were spending. Federal prosecutors documented a pattern of financial fraud that ran parallel to everything happening inside that facility. According to court records, the Hallfords had applied for and received nearly $900,000 in COVID-19 pandemic relief funds, federal money allocated by the government to help small businesses survive one of the most economically devastating periods in modern American history. The intent of that program was explicit: keep businesses open, keep workers paid, provide a lifeline to legitimate enterprises facing temporary financial hardship. According to prosecutors, the Hallfords used the money for something else entirely. 2 luxury vehicles, a GMC Yukon and an Infiniti. Together they were worth over $120,000. $31,000 moved into cryptocurrency accounts, shopping at Gucci, purchases at Tiffany and Co, laser body sculpting. That is what federal prosecutors said the Hallfords spent the money on. Money that was meant to help a small business survive a national emergency. while nearly 190 bodies lay unprocessed and decomposing in their facility. According to court records, some of those purchases were also made using money paid directly by grieving families for cremation services that were never performed. One victim, speaking at the sentencing hearing, put it as plainly as it could be put. He said that while the bodies rotted in secret, the Hallfords lived and laughed and dined. He said that his mother's cremation money had likely helped pay for a cocktail a day at the spa. A first-class flight. The discovery in October 2023 did not simply reopen grief for the affected families. It destroyed the structures they had built around it. Grief, when it is allowed to follow its natural course, creates something over time, a settled understanding that a person is gone, that they have been honored, that their physical remains have been treated with dignity. Rituals exist for precisely this reason. The service, the burial, the scattering of ashes at a meaningful place. These acts allow people to move forward. For the families of Return to Nature, all of that had been built on a lie. A woman who died in 2019, more than 4 years before the investigation, had been inside that building the entire time. Her grandson, a young boy named Colton Sperry, stood before the federal judge at the sentencing hearing and spoke about what that discovery had done to him. He described his grandmother as his second mother. He talked about the depression that swallowed him when he learned the truth. He told the courtroom that he had said to his parents, at his lowest point, that if he died too, he could go find her and talk to her again. His parents took him to the hospital for a mental health evaluation. He went into therapy. He was given an emotional support dog to help him through what followed. He stood at the lectern, his head barely visible above it, and told the judge he missed her. Derek Johnson had traveled 3,000 miles to attend the sentencing. He spoke about his mother. He told the judge he lay awake at night imagining what had happened to her inside that building. He asked the question aloud that he said kept him from sleeping, whether she was naked in there, whether she was stacked on top of others, treated not as a person but as an object, like lumber. He said the man who had done this had robbed him not just of his mother, but of the peace he had tried to build in her absence. Across the testimony of many families, certain themes repeated. Nightmares that would not stop, guilt over the fact that they had not known. At least one family member who had wondered, in the darkest corners of their grief, whether their loved one's soul could be at rest when the body never had been. These are the kinds of questions that do not have clean answers. And the Hallfords had placed those questions into hundreds of people's lives. Jon Hallford had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud in federal court in 2024. Separately, he entered guilty pleas in Colorado State Court to 191 counts of corpse abuse, 1 count for each body found in that building, and 1 additional count for the circumstances of the discovery itself. His state sentencing was scheduled for August 2025, but it was the federal sentencing that drew the families, the cameras, and the attention of a courtroom that Judge Nina Wong had made clear she intended to use for more than routine processing. At the hearing, Jon Hallford's attorney asked for 10 years. Federal prosecutors asked for 15. They laid out the scene for the judge in specific, documented detail, the rooms that could not be entered, the boards on the floor, the scale of what had accumulated inside. Hallford himself spoke before the sentence came down. He told Judge Wong that he had opened Return to Nature to make a positive impact. He said everything got completely out of control, especially him. He said he still hated himself. He apologized. Judge Wong did not pause long before responding. She noted that while the charge before the court was technically a fraud case, the circumstances and scale of Hallford's conduct, and the emotional devastation inflicted on hundreds of families, placed it in a category entirely its own. She said, directly and on the record, this is not an ordinary fraud case. She sentenced Jon Hallford to 20 years in federal prison, the maximum possible under the charge. The courtroom was quiet. Carrie Hallford, Jon's wife and co-owner of the business, faced her own proceedings separately. Charged with 191 counts of corpse abuse in state court and facing federal fraud charges. Her federal trial was scheduled for September 2025. Her state case hearing was set for the same month. The Return to Nature building in Penrose no longer stands. The Environmental Protection Agency dismantled and cleared the facility entirely. The lot where it sat is empty now. Whatever the building it held structurally, physically, and in terms of everything that had happened inside it, has been removed. But the families cannot remove what they carry. There are people who still have no real answer about what happened to their loved ones' remains inside that building, whether they were identified, whether the ashes they received years ago bore any connection to the person they lost. For some families, those answers may never fully come. What is known is this. For nearly 4 years, a man who told a community he was there to serve them in their worst moments was in fact doing the opposite. He was taking their money, storing their debt, and living on the proceeds. He built a life on the faith of people who had nowhere else to turn. Jon Hallford said in court that he still hated himself for what he had done. The boy who stood at the lectern, the one who could barely see above it, the one whose grandmother died in 2019 and who lay in that building for 4 more years, did not say anything about Jon Hallford's feelings about himself. He said he missed his grandmother. That is the sentence that stays with you. Jon Hallford is currently serving a 20-year federal sentence. Colorado state sentencing proceedings are ongoing. The full human cost of what happened inside Return to Nature funeral home is still, in many ways, being counted.